All right, we are in Proverbs 14. Last few weeks, we have focused on one major topic from each chapter. Tonight, we'll talk about three different topics. We are going to revisit one of the topics we've talked about before because it actually comes up multiple times throughout Proverbs, but three different topics we'll talk about tonight. And let's read through the chapter, and I'll make some different comments about some of the verses, some that we are going to talk about, and some that maybe we won't dive into any deeper. Verse 1, the wise woman builds her house, but with her own hands the foolish one tears hers down. Whoever fears the Lord walks uprightly, but those who despise him are devious in their ways. A fool's mouth lashes out with pride, but the lips of the wise protect them. Where there are no oxen, the manger is empty, but the strength of an ox come abundant harvests. It's an interesting verse right there, and I don't know if it's definitely actual. I wonder if it's also metaphorical of the idea that a hard worker is needed to carry out the abundant harvest. I think it's both potentially. Verse 5: an honest witness does not deceive, but a false witness pours out lies. The mocker seeks wisdom and finds none, but knowledge comes easily to the discerning. Stay away from a fool, for you will not find knowledge on their lips. The wisdom of the prudent is to give thought to their ways, but the folly of fools is deception. Fools mock at making amends for sin, but goodwill is found among the upright. Now, verse 10 and verse 13, I'm going to share them and then give you some ideas about what they might mean, because they're very interesting phrases. It's every once in a while you get into something that it's like, okay, last week we talked about this. Is this a wisdom statement, or is this just an observation? And these two verses, verse 10 and verse 13, you wonder, how are they wisdom statements? Are they observation statements? But let's read them, and I'll share a couple things about them. Verse 10, each heart knows its own bitterness, and no one else can share its joy. Now, one of the big challenges sometimes is when you read Proverbs, there'll be times when 3 or 4 verses focus on the same topic. And it's like, okay, I can get some sense of what this phrase means because there's 3 other verses around it that help. But there's also plenty of times in Proverbs where there's a phrase and it doesn't really seem to be connected to anything before or after it. That happens often in Proverbs. So the challenge is figuring out what it means. So each heart knows its own bitterness, and no one else can share its joy. And we'll talk about that one afterwards. Here's a possibility that regardless of how open or honest we can be with another person about our emotions, the truth of the matter is emotions in our lives cannot or will never be completely known by another person. So that idea of each heart knows its own bitterness, no one else can share the heart's joy, is that there's a part of us that is unknowable to other people. That might be what it's pointing to. So emotions in our lives cannot be known completely by another. There are things going on in our hearts, and remember the Hebrew idea of the heart is the seat of the will and the seat of the emotions. So there are things going on in our hearts which are our own, is the way I would put it, and known to no one else. No matter how open and honest we might be, there's still things that just are the deep things of our heart that may not be known to another person, but can be, of course, known by God. That's a possibility. I'll open it up for other thoughts during discussion. Verse 11, the house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death. Very well-known verse there. Then verse 13, even in laughter the heart may ache, and rejoicing may end in grief. So there's another statement that just is dropped in, and it's like, okay, what do we do with that one? It obviously is discussing the same thing as verse 10 discusses. It's discussing our emotional life. And so what does that mean when it says, even in laughter the heart may ache, and rejoicing may end in grief? So this might be a statement about a reality in our lives of this. There is the spectrum of joy and grief in our lives, and they're not necessarily like, oh, we're just joyful, or oh, we're just grieving. That all of this is intertwined. And so you can be joyful and at the same time also still dealing with sorrow in your life. And the opposite would also be true. So even in laughter, the heart may ache, and rejoicing may end in grief. The idea of the whole spectrum of emotions are available to us, and they are intertwined in different ways. That's a possibility. I find them interesting because they talk about our emotional life, where a lot of the other verses are talking about what goes on around us in our everyday journey. Verse 14, the faithless will be fully repaid for their ways, and the good rewarded for theirs. The simple believe anything, but the prudent give thought to their steps. The wise fear the Lord and shun evil, but a fool is hot-headed and yet feels secure. So a couple words that are popping up here within two verses. The first one is hot-headed. Verse 17, a quick-tempered person does foolish things, and the one who devises evil schemes is hated. So there's two phrases there, hot-headed, quick-tempered, and the idea is, let's just talk about the opposite. The cool-headed or the slow-tempered person are signs of a wise and prudent person. And all of us have challenges in that regard. We all have times where we want to get wound up emotionally over things. I can remember when I was a youth pastor, some days you have victory and some days you have defeat. I was driving one of my teens in the church van to we had a youth conference in Detroit, and he was unable to come the first day, so I drove, which was only 30 miles. I drove up to his house. I picked him up, and we were driving. We're on 94 in Detroit, and we're driving along, and we're talking, and all of a sudden this guy just completely cuts me off, and under my breath, what I said was, well, excuse me. And Dax, who is in my youth group, he's like a 7th grader, he looks at me and he goes, so is that the full extent of your road rage? And I thought to myself, well, if it is, I won that one. At least, a 7th grade kid in my church thinks that my, my temper is not, ranked up here, There are days where our temper gets the best of us, and the growth toward wisdom in our life basically is the opportunity to be as cool-headed as possible, to be slow to anger, and that is a sign of a wise and prudent person. And so, when it's, all of us have individual challenges, and some people's challenges is hot-tempered, angered, things of that nature. That's a growth area for people, and people should recognize that is, if I'm struggling with being quick-tempered in the development of a wise life, I need to look at that and ask the Holy Spirit to help me in that particular area. Verse 18, the simple inherit folly, but the prudent are crowned with knowledge. Evildoers will bow down in the presence of the good, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous. The poor are shunned even by their neighbors, but the rich have many friends. It is a sin to despise one's neighbor, but blessed is the one who is kind to the needy. So if verse 20 was sitting there by itself, it would be hard to understand what the purpose of it is. The poor are shunned even by their neighbors, but the rich have many friends. Again, it's almost a phrase of observation versus a wisdom statement. But it's coupled with verse 21. So it gives some understanding of what does this mean. And it's basically pointing to the idea that if you're going to be a good neighbor, you're not going to shun the poor. So the natural, inherent desire of the sinful nature is to be chummy with the rich and to ignore the poor. It's just if we are going to be given over to the sinful nature, we're going to chase after money and we're going to ignore the poor. That's kind of what that phrase is pointing to. But then it says, but blessed is the one who is kind to the needy. And the phrase before it, it's a sin to despise one's neighbor. So to basically shun a neighbor because they are a person of poverty, verse 21 says it's a sinful act. And that we should recognize that if there is a person who is needy around us, it's an opportunity for God to work through us in a giving spirit. And to be honest, I think if we are, one of the things that this may also point to is, remember that verse that we were talking about is don't put up money for a stranger? And we were talking about this idea of the Bible really teaches to be wise when it comes to giving to people you don't know. Don't decide, oh, we're going to give to people even though we don't know them. But the Bible is, but on the flip side, the Bible recognizes that if you do know them, whether it's neighbor or family or friend or something like that, that is the place to give to the needy. And the reason is because the relationship allows you to have the wisdom to know whether your money is going to a good cause. That doesn't mean you automatically give to your neighbor. Doesn't mean you automatically sign a pledge for your neighbor because he's not a stranger or she's not a stranger. But it means the relationship enables you to have wisdom in how you give. And so, for instance, you can give hilariously to someone in need. And what that phrase means is it's not to give in a funny manner. To give hilariously means to be ready for the Holy Spirit to ask you to give and be ready to respond at a moment's notice. So when you have a family that lives next to you or you have a neighbor or something that's needy, if you see something, same thing with people who go to church with you because they're your neighbor also, is when you see someone who has a valid need, and you have the ability to give, you should give. Because you can recognize that need. You have the wisdom to recognize that it is actually a need. It's not simply somebody wanting to take advantage of somebody else. It's an actual need, and you can give to that need in relationship with a neighbor, a family, a friend, a fellow churchgoer, something like that. Verse 22, do not those who plot evil go astray, but those who plan what is good find love and faithfulness. All hard work brings a profit, but mere talk leads only to poverty. The wealth of the wise is their crown, but the folly of fools yields folly. A truthful witness saves lives, but a false witness is deceitful. Whoever fears the Lord has a secure fortress, and for their children it will be a refuge. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, turning a person from the snares of death. A large population is a king's glory, but without subjects a prince is ruined. Whoever is patient has great understanding, but one who is quick-tempered displays folly. A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their Maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. When calamity comes, the wicked are brought down, but even in death the righteous seek refuge in God. Wisdom reposes in the heart of the discerning, and even among fools she lets herself be known. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin condemns any people. A king delights in a wise servant, but a shameful servant arouses his fury. So that's Proverbs 14. Let's take a break, and then we will dive into the first of potentially 3 topics that we'll talk about tonight.
Back in 1 minute.
Of Proverbs is wisdom and folly. And so you see so many verses where basically it's the wise do this, the foolish do this.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just back and forth with the compare contrast is very visible, and it's also apparent in other scriptures, like for instance, when so many times in scripture things are compared, the metaphors of light and darkness are used. So there's always it's just a constant in scripture of a compare contrast, good, evil, light, darkness, wise, foolish. It's just a natural, so it becomes a natural literary device that they
Yes.
use. Yeah.
And occasionally it's negative.
Yeah, in which case then they're focusing on the one, they're basically focusing on the foolishness, the whole verse.
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We are back on.
All right, a deeper dive. We talked about this topic before, and verse 23 says, "All hard work brings a profit, but mere talk leads only to poverty." So deeper dive into this idea of diligence, which comes up over and over and over again in Proverbs. And I think it's important. A lot of times, by the time we get, at least the people around this table, by the time you get to a certain point in your life, the hope is that you have recognized the need for hard work, you're willing to do it, and you have the wisdom to do it. It doesn't mean always, because just as being quick-tempered can be a temptation, not being a hard worker can be a temptation also. But I think part of the reason this is important is because I see in our culture it's harder and harder for young people to develop a good work ethic. And there's multiple reasons for that, one of which is our culture tends to teach you can find fortune and fame going the easy way. You know, win the lottery, get online and get 1 million followers, and that, the idea that riches is easy, or that success is easy, is touted and promised in our culture, unfortunately. And so I want to talk about this topic from the perspective of how do we communicate to younger people the idea of being diligent and developing a work ethic. Because the other side about what culture teaches is they're also challenged with potentially not having had a person in their life who shows them what diligence looks like. And I give you for instance, in my life, I don't think I've told this story here. I told it at the men's retreat that I did a couple months back, about a time when I was probably 11 or 12 years old. And the one thing that my brother and I didn't particularly like doing was going and getting wood for the winter. My dad would, cut the trees down with the chainsaw, and he'd cut them into lengths, and we had to pick them up and put them in the truck or put them in the car and drag them home, and he would chop them up, and we had to stack wood, and that's how we heated the home all winter long. So my number in my head was we always needed to get 13 cord of wood put down before the first, or before the cold weather came from. And I can remember being out in the woods one day with my brother and my dad, and there was a big log that I was trying to roll up the hill. And I for whatever reason, had gotten in my head that I wanted to get this log roll up the hill. I thought I could do it. It's just that point where it's heavy enough for me to be a challenge, but not too heavy. And I'm pushing it up the hill, and my brother turns around, and he was 2 years older, much bigger than me, and he goes, "I'll help you, Matt." And my dad said, "No, he can do it." And I don't know why I remember this, but to me it was like one of those times where my dad I could see the look of pride in his eyes as I was pushing this up the hill. He stopped. And he was watching me, and then I did it, and he rewarded me verbally. And he wasn't one that did that whole lot of that, so for me it was like golden, to get that. But my dad was a hard worker. My brother's a hard worker. It was instilled in us to be hard workers. Now I can tell you this: sometimes I can veg on the couch for a long period of time, but when there's a focused thing in front of me, I grew up in a setting where that was valued. And the first question I would ask about that is, do you have something you can point to on how that diligence was developed in your life? What did you have it modeled by someone? How did you develop a diligent spirit in your life? Because of my opinion is, I know most of the people around this table, for people who are watching, I believe that the people around this table are hardworking people and have developed that. So the way I'm kind of going to move this along is examples of how we develop that diligence, but also what we can say to the next generation that would help them understand how important the idea of being diligent in your life is.
I think I was just told to do it, and there was no choice. I had to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And the fear of reprisal was, I never got beat or anything, but just the fear of my father was there, where I had to do it, whatever it was. I used to hate weeding.
Weeding, oh yeah.
Weeding,
Yeah.
and every Saturday I had to go out and weed.
Yeah.
His rocky gardens, it was all rocks, and he never put down any paper either.
He just expected
Just
the weeder
weeds.
to do it.
Yeah, the weeder had to do it. But there were many other projects, and I remember one time though, he came out and helped me, and we had to take a stump out, and it took us like 10 days to dig this big giant stump out, but we got it, and he was there helping, so when we got it done, it was that feeling of accomplishment, and lots of sweat and dirt, but we got it done.
Yeah.
So kind of the same thing, where he said, "We can do it, and I'll help you."
Yeah.
Usually he didn't help. But I'm glad he did with the stump.
And there's specific moments that we have that I think really do kind of encapsulate that whole idea of developing a diligent, and you look at something like a stump, and it's like, okay, it was just a stump, but it becomes more than that. It becomes like, look what we were able to accomplish,
To kind of tag on to Marco's, there was, my dad was a very hard worker too. Both my parents were. But, you mentioned, and I think this is kind of where some of the younger generations don't fall into. When your dad told you to do something, just like my dad would tell me to do something as a kid, you did it. And you did it because you respect, there was the fear of, well, am I going to get backhanded? But it's also, you respected his authority.
Right.
And there was that respect for authority because he was your dad. He told you to do something, and therefore you did it. But, and so that's kind of, when you had mentioned that, I kind of thought, well, yeah, and there doesn't seem to be, I'm not saying, sweeping generalization
Right.
of every generation, but there seems to be a lack of that in this day and age.
Well,
for authority.
right.
And people telling the younger generation what to do. They don't want to be told what to do.
Well, one of the big issues is when you start to, and I'll let the ladies can chime in about this, but from a man's perspective, it was our fathers that brought that to us. And in broken families where there's not a man in the house, it's harder for people. The mom has to take that on. If it's the mom is the main caregiver, she's taking on what is oftentimes the responsibility of the father as far as charting that course of discipline for a child's life. And so if you have a one-parent home and the mother is either unable or unwilling to chart that discipline course, then it's going to be hard for the kids growing up. Now, I would say also the opposite is true. I agree with your statement about it's more and more kids are not understanding that diligence. But what I do see sometimes when we do estate sales and when we interact with some of the young people that come to our sales, you can tell they're sharp kids, and they want that kind of direction, and they will respond to that sort of thing. So you're right. You can't have a sweeping generalization, but if we are more and more of a culture of everything is easy and you don't have to work for it, then it's going to be hard for kids to develop a diligent spirit.
Well, I mean, for myself, it was my dad. But my dad, he modeled it. He was such a hard worker. But I think, like, he was good at encouraging me. And when there was tasks I didn't want to do, like, I mean, I was 7, and one of my jobs was I had to vacuum the dining room before, and move all the chairs. You got a big dining room at a restaurant, and so I had to vacuum that. And I didn't like doing it because it took me hours to move all the chairs and vacuum and move them back. And so my dad, because he wanted to encourage me, and I didn't know this till I was older, he started throwing coins around the dining room so that I would find them. And then I was vacuuming super good. And I was like, and I didn't know till I was a teenager that he did it. Because I'm like, man, I used to find the most money. He goes, yeah, that's because I threw it there so you vacuum and quit complaining. But it's like, he modeled being such a good worker. And then, and I loved working for my dad, and I loved that he appreciated me. And so you wanted to do a good job. You wanted to make him happy.
That's another way, like you were asking, different ways, but that's a really good way is modeling, show them you're a hard worker, and hopefully they'll follow you.
Yeah.
And Joni's, I'm thinking your mom was the one that.
She was the one, yeah.
Yeah, she was the one that disciplined you guys or gave you tasks versus the father.
Well, and there's just we don't mention fathers and dads just because they're the only ones. There are women who are fantastic at getting their kids focused and getting things accomplished. I'll give you an example of discipline that I find interesting, though, when it comes to how the need for both the father and the mother, but what a father does in a home is, I ran into this statistic, and I'm going to lessen this statistic because I don't remember the exact number, but the statistic is somewhere around if as a family grows, so kids are already a little older and able to do for their own, if a mom at some point in life decides that she's going to go to church. So this would be in a setting where nobody's gone to church for years. Kids are already grown enough to start whining or not wanting to go or having their own decision being made, that sort of thing. If a mother decides to go to church, the statistic is less than 20% of the time will the family go to church with her. So 80+% of the time, if she decides to go to church at that point in life, the family won't go with her. If a father decides to go to church in the same time period, 80+% of the family will go with the father. So there is a huge discrepancy in regards to how, and that it may be that spirit of discipline where the father just says, we're going to church. That can be a part of it. But the issue is, when it comes to how a family interacts, the father being there to guide and discipline is extremely needed. And if it doesn't exist, it puts the onus on the mom. Doesn't mean that particular moms can't do a great job, but you're adding to what everything else they're supposed to be doing, basically. Whereas the father is supposed to bring that discipline and that guidance and that idea of diligence and hard work. All right, the two verses that I threw out an option for. What's the wisdom in these two verses that are difficult to unravel? The first one is verse 10. Each heart knows its own bitterness, and no one else can share its joy. And so what I had thrown out is emotions in our lives can't completely be known by another. So the interesting thing about that is, one way you could put that is, we are emotional beings that are desperately in need of sharing those emotions with other persons, but to some extent, we are an island. That's what I'm suggesting the verse might mean, is that no matter how much of the time we may want to emotionally connect with people, that verse suggests that there is a part of us that is an island that isn't going to be known, or is only going to be known by God. What are your thoughts about that one? Or what are your thoughts about other options for how that verse can be interpreted? Because I do not know on this one. I just throw that out as an option.
I think you're quite accurate, because I don't think no one is gonna know us other than God. Like,
Completely.
yeah, you can be open with your spouse or your best friend and tell them all sorts of deep, dark secrets, but you're never gonna share with somebody everything, where God knows it all. And
And the suggestion is not just that you wouldn't share it, is
Right.
that you couldn't share it. It's just
Okay.
impossible for you.
Well, yeah,
Even if
there's
you
some
wanted to
things, yeah.
share it, it would not be possible to be knowable completely by another person.
right, I agree.
Well, there's certain there's things both on the positive, the joy side of it, and on the whatever darker anger, whatever you want to label, that only you know that feeling, and you can't express that. You had mentioned when your son died, that there was just this feeling within you that you just couldn't express.
Yeah.
And I think we all have pieces of that, or areas of that within us that
You're without words, you're
Right.
just undone.
yeah.
Yeah, and that goes back to a series I taught on that was entitled "There Are No Words." That there are certain things that are inexpressible, and this verse suggests that it's on both sides of the emotional spectrum. And so, like, I can remember when my first son was born, and I always say that despite the fact that I had 9 months to prepare, I was not prepared at all for the fact that there were 5 people in the room at one moment, and then suddenly there's 6 people in the room. I mean, it just boggled I was just dumbfounded that this could happen. And it made me even more aware of the sanctity of life, of how beautiful life is, that something like that can occur within a woman's womb over a period of 9 months, and then suddenly there's another human being. It just really blew my mind the first time I was in that kind of a setting, and there weren't really any words for me to describe how amazing that was. Now, at the same time, when you lose somebody who's very close, there are no words on that side either to be able to express what you're going through. And you can have people talk to you and want to have you open up and share with them, and you can to a certain point, but there's just some things that are, inexpressible, basically. Verse 13, even in laughter the heart may ache, and rejoicing may end in grief. And the suggestion on this one that I had was, it's kind of a statement about the reality of our lives, the spectrum that we have emotionally of both joy and grief, and the fact that all of it is intertwined. Even there was I don't remember who the philosopher was. It was somebody, I believe, who was a thinker philosopher, and he talked at one point about, I went out last night and I was funny, I was clever, I was well loved, and then I came home and wanted to shoot myself. It was just it was a really weird statement about this idea of how the public persona of a person can hide what's going on behind the scenes in a person's life. And this idea that one can be joyful in the moment, but still have tremendous struggle in their life at the same time. And this verse may point to that idea that we are such complicated emotional creatures that we can be joyful in a moment even though our whole world is falling apart, or vice versa. We can be sorrowful in a moment, but be able to live in a time of very strong joy in our lives. What's your thought about that? Even in laughter, the heart may ache, and rejoicing may end in grief.
I think we see that a lot at funerals, the first statement there.
Mm-hmm.
People are talking about the life of a person that they loved, and they'll tell a funny story, and the whole church laughs.
Yeah.
Everybody's laughing, and there's some joy there, but still everybody's heart's aching at that point. And I think the first part of that is talking about something that's already happened in the past, and the second part, it seems like it's talking about something that's in the future, where it says rejoicing may end in grief.
In grief.
So it almost seems like, yeah, it could end if you're rejoicing, I don't know, too much. Then you're going to end in grief.
Well, and the interesting thing about that is, like, when I think of the funeral setting, is you can have the person, or you can have the setting where a joke, and to be honest, a funny story in a funeral will get a huge laugh. And the reason is because, I don't know if this is a great word to use, but there's like a tension. There's this tremendous sorrow and this grief that's occurring, and it's almost like the humor breaks that tension some that's naturally occurring. But the truth of the matter is those people might cry for a moment, and then they still go back to weeping. And so laughter, in the idea of joy may end in grief, could be a part of that also.
Joni, what were you going to say something?
Our friend who lost their son, when we were visiting them, she's fighting hard because they're joyful people. She just said, I need to be joyful, and so they'll spend time with us and laugh and, reminisce and talk about things, and they're truly joyful, but when they leave us, they're faced with that, emptiness again. So that's
Yeah.
the problem.
Yeah.
I think when you brought that example up, or maybe it was something Marco said, it sparked two people, Robin Williams and Dom DeLuise, both whose public personas were just these funny men, but yet, and I don't know about Dom DeLuise, but in Robin Williams' case, he was so tormented outside of the public life that he ended his own life, and so that was that kind of example kind of came to mind.
And there is some truth to the fact that the jester is the saddest person in the room. People become jesters because they're trying to deal with oftentimes a tremendous amount of hurt, and they use humor. I know they talk very openly about the idea of when kids get picked on, one of the ways that they brush that off is through humor. Not every child does it, but there's the class clown oftentimes is the one that is trying to find a way to be accepted, and they hit on this idea of if I'm funny, I'm accepted, and maybe it's because there's something about them. Overweight, oftentimes you see a lot of comedians that are overweight, and so they're going to get picked on because of their weight. So what do? They find out if they tell a joke, suddenly the attention shifts away from their making fun of their weight to the joke, and kids laugh. And so they get this idea of, is if I can be funny, then I shift the attention away from my weaknesses or my infirmities. And that's not necessarily a healthy thing for them long term, because they're always pursuing a way to laugh, even though on the inside it's really covering something, covering a hurt up is the challenge. And it doesn't mean every comedian is like that, but they talk about that's one of the reasons that people become funny men, or class clowns or comedians.
I think of Darnell
Hmm?
from Costco.
Yeah.
Darnell, did you know him?
Yeah.
Yes,
And
yes.
just, he was so joyful. He was voted nicest guy in Traverse City or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But he had some darkness
Yep.
he
Yeah.
was battling.
Well, we have some family, they, that struggle with depression. And it is sad because they're very funny people, they seem very happy and joyful, but they both struggle, the husband and wife both struggle with depression. And it's just really sad.
And that's like that, what I said earlier, that guy who said, I went to the dinner party and I was, accepted and I was clever and I was well liked, and I go home and I want to kill myself.
Right.
And that's something we need to, when people are struggling with things like that, is we need to help them to become real in that moment, is because I think one of the things that's happening is, in order to be liked, accepted, whatever, they're putting on a mask, a persona that's not really them. And so in essence they are, and I'll use the term hypocrite means two-faced, and I don't mean that, in a sense I mean that they're spiritually hypocritical. I don't mean that they're the hypocritical of the Pharisees, not that type of hypocritical, but they're showing a public persona that's different from the private person. So in essence, they are being hypocritical in their spiritual and emotional life. And that's where we have to help people understand is there's more to you underneath the surface that's worthwhile. You don't have to put the mask on, All right, so we'll end there. That is Proverbs chapter 14. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.